Hello, I am Cora Schroeder, and today you will join myself and Miss Miki Conn, and we will talk about a phenomenal life that she has lived and the activism that she has incorporated in her life. Your family moved to the Albany area, I believe, in 1957.
Yes.
And when you were roughly around 12, and your sister, Fern,
Yes.
she was younger than you.
She was 8.
8 years old. So you and Fern lived in Brooklyn first with your grandmother?
Yeah, well, actually, we spent the summer in Brooklyn.
Summer in Brooklyn.
While my parents were searching for housing.
Right. And so during that time, tell us, if you will, about your mother and father and their education and occupations for us to start.
Okay, so Mom and Dad met as college students. Dad was going to Howard University. Mom had been going to Hampton Institute, but needed to work. And so she moved to the DC area to go to Howard and work. And so they met in the unemployment line. And that conversation that they had there blossomed into a relationship. And Dad was looking for an intelligent woman. Mom was looking for a man with brains and caring, and they were both, as students, I don't want to say radical, but they kind of flirted around with, learning about communism. They were activists in the sense of being involved in the labor movement. The civil rights movement wasn't yet I should say the incarnation of the civil rights movement that I was involved in had not yet become a reality. So my father became a physician, and my mother became a homemaker and an artist. She was multi-talented in the arts, both visual arts and music. Played classical guitar as well as folk music, and so their life together had 3 parts: the contribution to the community, the arts, and the family.
Love can be found in so many interesting places. As
Yes.
You said, they were in the unemployment line. So further about your family, Miki, it says here that you lived in Alaska
Yes.
for a bit, and before coming to Albany. What drew your parents to Alaska, and how was that?
Well, my father at the time had gone into the military to help pay for his medical education. So he had dues to pay, in a sense. And this was during the Korean War. He did not want to go to war. So the public health service was an alternative, and he was given the option of several locations to work with the public service, public health. He chose Alaska because he thought at this point he had 1 child and an infant. My sister was an infant at the time, and that it was a healthier environment to raise children in, healthier than, I think the other option they were looking at was India. And so they chose Alaska as a safe, healthy place to be.
And just so you would say it was a safe, healthy place to be. Any experiences that you can remember about being there? I know you were very young.
Alaska was one of my favorite places to live. So we could do a whole show on growing up in Alaska, which I won't do,
Right.
but one of the interesting things was that it was a very diverse community. There were lots of people, strangely, from the Philippines that worked where we were in Alaska, Mount Edgecombe. There was a hospital there. And so a lot of the hospital staff included people from the Philippines, people from all over the United States, racial mixtures, and then the local people who consisted of the Tlingit tribe and the Eskimos as well. So that was the mix. Because of the kind of person my dad was, he provided services to the local people who were generally impoverished. They were by trade fishermen, farmers, that kind of thing. You don't make a lot of money in those jobs. And Dad would treat them not for money, but in exchange for fish, chicken, or what have you. And because of that, people became very fond of him, and so our entire family was adopted into the Tlingit tribe. And I remember very clearly that whole experience, which was just very moving. And I went to school there, elementary school, so I remember all of the things there. But what stands out to me at this point in my life is that there were not racial issues, that I was to experience that later on and had really no preparation or anticipation of it. That there was distinction based on income level and how people dressed and whether what your parents did, but it was not racially based. So that was interesting.
And with that, kind of moving then now, so your family then relocated to the Albany area?
Yeah.
So you were saying there was some, it was very nice and pleasant in Alaska. Can you give us a little bit of a correlation between now moving to Albany area and Alaska? Was there a big change, a big difference?
Huge. And it was for all of us. If I start with my parents, I don't think they anticipated the amount of hostility that they would face searching for housing. That they wanted, based on the freedom and the lifestyle that we had in Alaska, they wanted a place that was suburban, that had big yards for kids to play in. We had requested a climbing tree, and they didn't realize what a challenge it would be to find a good school district. They were looking for a good environment in which to raise their children. Instead, they eventually found it because they stuck to the search, but all through searching, they were subject to hostility, people not wanting them to move into areas that were predominantly white. Even in the inner city, there were neighborhoods where they were poor themselves, but still did not want blacks moving into their neighborhood. So that on the adult level was a problem that they did not anticipate. On the kid level, my level, essentially. I was going into middle school. And middle school is the age that you start dating or noticing the opposite sex and so on. People were curious maybe for the first couple of days, you know, who were these people? But then after that, I had no friends. That the first friend locally that I made was when I got to high school, and she was Jewish and subject to the same situation. So we became friends because we were the only people that could be there for each other.
So you're talking, when you were mentioning moving, it sounds like redlining. Even in the urban and suburban, there was still that redlining going on when you moved to the Albany area.
Yes.
Miki, if you could share a little bit more about a little bit more of the specifics of the neighborhood and the home that you lived in here in upstate New York.
So the first home was, we rented from Arlen and Ken Burr. They had no objections, no fears, no concerns. They felt like they were moving away for a relatively short period of time, and they wanted to rent their house, and we seemed like a good family to them to rent the house from. It was in a neighborhood where there was a lot of new houses being built, and the people there, the Burrs knew their neighbors and so forth, but the neighbors had reservations, and they weren't expressed to me. When my mother wrote her book, I learned more about the parental side, the adult side. But for me, the experience came from what happened in school. But as far as the neighborhood, it was a modern house, comfortable house, a middle-class neighborhood, I would say. Yeah.
If you could maybe share your view, and if you know anything, but how did your family and your parents feel about living in an all-white neighborhood? Is there anything that you can remember, a reflection or attitudes that you observed at such a young age?
They wanted us to be happy, and they were willing to sort of cart us to wherever we needed to go to have friends and associates. It was difficult for them because the age difference between my sister and me, that I was essentially going on becoming a teenager. She was an elementary school child. As an elementary school child, she was not considered a threat, and so while she had lots of friends and a social life, a life outside of school, I did not. Because I didn't understand racism and prejudice.
Right.
My parents didn't really do a lot of explanation about that. I had to, or I did, conclude that there was something wrong with me, that my sister was sort of the way kids were supposed to be, and somehow I was not. And during that time, to add insult to injury, I had glasses, I had braces, I was a chubby kid, you know, so I looked at all of these things as evidence that, you know, I just didn't have what was needed. But I never concluded, well, really until maybe even the end of high school, I never concluded that it had to do with the family's race.
Staying a little bit on that same topic, living in Del Mar, right, which is a suburb of upstate New York,
Right.
right outside of Albany. Can you remember some specific or a specific incident that can be deemed racial while your family was living in Del Mar?
Yeah. One of the ones that really kind of sticks with me is that there was a student who attended. He lived in Del Mar and went to Bethlehem Central Middle School. He invited me over to visit at his home after school. In hindsight, I think that his parents were trying to be welcoming, and he was the time that I was at his house, he was very insulting, very mean, and after a while I said, you know what, I think I should go home. And he said, why? You're not having fun? Don't you? He said, I thought you people laugh and joke and what's the problem? And I didn't really know how to respond, but when he said, you people, that I thought you people laugh and joke, that was kind of my first inkling that, oh, he doesn't see me as myself. He sees me as part of this amorphous group called Negroes. I also experienced through my parents, the schools at the time were tracked. So there was the college prep track, and there was I don't know what they called it, but the track for kids who really weren't going anywhere.
Right.
So I didn't know that there were tracks, and I didn't know what track I was in.
Right.
But some of the paperwork or something that I brought home revealed to my father that I was not in the college prep track. And the whole reason for us moving to Del Mar was that the schools were supposed to be excellent and that we'd have a leg up wherever we wanted to go to college. It was just assumed that we would. So when Dad realized this, he was like, I'm coming to school with you tomorrow, and we're going to get this straightened out.
Right.
And it was scary because it was a side of my father that I'd never seen, never had to see. Didn't know, are parents supposed to go to school and lay down the law to to school people, But he did get me switched into the college prep class. I mean, their defense was that we didn't think she'd need it. So that was an experience through my father. And I had other experiences through teachers as well.
So we talked a little bit about your family moving there and experiencing the discrimination and the neighborhood, and even some specifics on discrimination in the school. Before we leave, as it were, Del Mar, New York, and go and talk more about your college years, is there anything more you wanted to add about living in Del Mar as a young woman?
Yeah, that although the experience was not a great one, and that I wouldn't wish it on anyone, at the same time, I guess because I'm a person who looks for the silver lining, that I realize that experience has a lot to do with who I am today, who I became. And my sense of independence came from not being a part of a group that since I was not a part of a group, I could make my own choices, my own decisions. I mean, I still had to listen to my parents, but in general, the students in high school, really had to follow the path of the popular kids, that the kids who were not the popular kids tried their best to copy them,
Right.
and so on. And I could just be myself. And that independence has stayed with me all my life. And so, although I would not ask for that opportunity again, I like who I am, I like who I became, I like the strengths that developed out of that.
Thank you, Miki. So as we thank you for that foundation. So moving forward in your life to college,
Yeah.
can you explain to us or help us understand why you picked going to Howard in Washington, D.C., Howard University?
So at the time of looking for colleges, I had not heard of Howard. I had heard my parents mention it, but it was, you pay more attention to people in your age group. So my one girlfriend had the places that she was considering. They did not include Howard. And I had made some friends at a summer camp, and they had places they were considering, which did not include Howard. So my parents decided that I would either go to SUNY, which was then, I think, New York State Teachers College or something like that I would go there and live at home, which was not, or I would at least do 1 year at Howard. I didn't want either of those options, but I was living in an age where you still kind of did what your parents wanted you to do. So the compromise was, okay, I'll go to Howard for a year. And then after that year, I can go anywhere that I get accepted.
Right.
So that was the compromise. However, I never left Howard. Once I was there, it was a wonderful experience that I couldn't anticipate. And I appreciate the wisdom of my parents in knowing that was what I needed.
So as Howard is a historically black college and coming from a very white neighborhood, and as you were explaining, going to the high school and having, can you shed some light again on that correlation? How was it for you to go to a historically black college from being inundated in a traditionally white neighborhood at Del Mar, New York?
Right. So, first of all, I had never seen so many black people in all my life. They were everywhere. And second of all, people were friendly. Everybody spoke. Even if they didn't know you, they spoke to you, acknowledged your presence, greeted you. I didn't date during high school, so it was a shock to me that male students were asking me out, and I didn't know how to handle the social aspects. I did, however, I was a good student, and I knew how to do that. It was, how could I say, easy to make friends there. And the courses that I was in were also easy for me. I think because Bethlehem Central had been a good school district, and once I was in the college prep track, there were many ways in which the northern students were ahead of the southern students academically. And so that gave me the freedom to get involved in the civil rights movement. that I didn't have to, I mean, my parents rolled their eyes every time they heard me say this, but I didn't have to devote as much time to homework as some of the other students did. And so I could go for a weekend to a demonstration and get my homework done.
You were in, when you went to school, and it sounds like you started to get more involved and feel more comfortable in being involved and being accepted. So
Right.
also, as I understand, you were there and you began to involve yourself in nonviolent movements. If you could talk a little bit about those organizations and how you, if you will, integrated yourself into them,
Yeah.
coming from a very different world.
So I think wherever you go, you wind up with your crowd, or you find your crowd of students. So not intentionally, like I knew what my crowd was and was looking for it, but it developed that the people that I spent the most time were a a level or so above me, and B, active in the civil rights movement themselves. So it was very easy to become a part of the activist crowd, so to speak. And I was like a mascot in a way, because I was younger and smaller in stature and totally uneducated socially. So there was a lot of, big brothers and big sisters who took me under their wing and would have to explain things to their little country cousin. But what everyone saw and acknowledged was that I was definitely an activist, regarding getting involved in demonstrations, organizing, and so on. Now, as far as nonviolence is concerned, at that time, that was the direction of the movement. It was pre-Black Power, and it was so it was a very integrated group, even though we were at a Black college. So white students from other local colleges were a part of this particular group that I worked with, the Nonviolent Action Group. That was and I have to interrupt myself, I just had a thought that it's interesting, the space that we were given to hold NAG, which is what we called the group, Nonviolent Action Group. The space that we were given was offered by the Newman Club, which is a Catholic group that existed at Howard. And I didn't know enough to wonder why there was a Catholic group at Howard, but there were so many groups. So they gave us space to hold our meetings in and do pretty much whatever members of the Newman Club could do. We could use the space, like that was our space. And then after the first year, we began to hear about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And some of the members of NAG became members and active in SNCC. Some of them were older students who were approaching graduation and had more freedom and flexibility. Because the SNCC meetings, I believe they were in Atlanta for the most part, but they were not at Howard or Washington, D.C. So, yeah, those were the two groups that I worked with. Mm-hmm. However, those two groups, all of the groups worked together. So those two groups worked with the NAACP, the Congress on Racial Equality Corps. So whenever there was a demonstration, it would be a coalition of all of these groups that would organize and participate.
So you're a young person now. You're if you will finding your footing in a traditional historically black college. What are some of the key strong personalities that you attach yourself to or learn about? Names of people that you can remember, or any personalities that kept you on that path of activism?
Stokely Carmichael, who became, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I just blanked out on his name. Ed Brown, who is the brother, or was, he's deceased now, he was the brother of Rap Brown, who also changed his name. But so I got to know Rap through Ed, but Ed was my big brother friend, and very, very much active in the movement. Butch Conn, who I married, so he transitioned from big brother to spouse. Mike Thelwell, who I believe is teaching up here still, in North Adams or that area. But anyway, those were what would I say, the strategists in the Nonviolent Action Group and SNCC. And those were the people I spent a lot of time with. Let me think. There were others whose, it interests me that they were primarily males. The women that I got to know were not activists. They were involved, some of them involved with sororities and sorority work. Students, they were, but they were not activists. There were some whose names have changed through marriage, like Jean Wheeler was very much an activist, and I don't know, we didn't stay in touch after college. But for the most part, it was men, and it was men that I worked with.
And so you also, so in these groups, and you did a lot of demonstrating, Cambridge and Maryland. Can you talk a little bit about the demonstrating and how you did it, how that affected you?
Right. So, word of mouth was how we found out about demonstrations, or at the NAG meetings, they would be announced. Usually there was an orientation in advance of the demonstration to kind of let you know the purpose of this specific demonstration. And I'll use one as an example. So the one in Cambridge, Maryland, it was a coalition of organizations, largely students, from across the Washington, D.C. area. Huge meeting held in which nonviolence and the principles of nonviolence were explained, so that people knew that what they were facing, that your safety couldn't be guaranteed. If you were treated offensively, you were not to respond in kind, that you were there showing love in a way for the people who wanted to attack you. that love was stronger than hate, and that you don't give what you get in the sense of the demonstration. So how do you do that? And part of the orientation is to learn the freedom songs, because the freedom songs, the act of singing together, strengthens the group, helps you focus on your purpose, distracts you from wondering what is going to happen when you get there. There were a lot of reasons that the singing was an important aspect, as important, I would say, as understanding nonviolence and the purpose of nonviolence. In addition, there was explanation of what you were likely to expect in terms of how people wherever you were going would treat you. So in the case of Cambridge, Maryland, there were 3 options. The movies were segregated, so that meant, the way they did it in Cambridge anyway, is that black people sat up in the balcony and white people sat downstairs. So now if you're going in the demonstration and you're black, you're going to sit downstairs with the white people.
Right.
And make them force you out, simply by refusing to go upstairs. And then they had to figure out what they were going to do with you if you were not going to go upstairs under your own steam. So that was one. And also sitting with white people, that the buses that took us out from DC to Maryland were, the people on the buses were racially mixed. So you could go into the movies with white people and black people together, sit where you're not supposed to sit, and then wait to see what happens. Cafe. To go to a cafe, black people were not allowed in, period. So now you're walking in a place that you know you're not allowed, and then you're going to sit down with white people who are also demonstrators and are anticipating that you would sit there with them. So, and there again, you would be told as a black person that you're not allowed in here and that you need to leave, and you politely refuse to leave, and then you just wait for them to handle it. The third thing that was going on in Cambridge the day that we were there was a carnival. And the carnival had certain days that white people could go and certain days that black people could go. And so black people were going on, naturally, on a day that black people were not supposed to go. And again, let them handle it, figure out what they're going to do. And letting them handle it, relinquishing your natural fight or resistance was an act of courage and an act of determination and an act of will, because you knew what your greater goal was. And it wasn't necessarily that it was so important to go to that movie or whatever. It was to get the laws changed, to demonstrate that these laws were ridiculous, and that people should be treated equally. So what else can I tell you about it? So what happened in that demonstration is that we were all brought to the Armory, which was the biggest building in a small town. We were brought to the Armory, we were fingerprinted, information, was taken about us. The NAACP took the role of legal defenders for us. We were jailed, and then the following day, we had to go to court. The NAACP pleaded for us not guilty, and then we were sent on our way. We were lucky in that demonstration in the sense that nobody was injured, the police were not violent. Farther south, there probably would have been more violence, more difficulty. Butch, my husband, went to a different demonstration, and he was dragged down the street and sustained injuries that plagued him through his life. I can't account for the difference between one town and another, and you don't know when you're going out, what you're going to be facing.
So hamburgers.
Hamburgers, oh, yes. So McDonald's
Yes.
was new at the time. And they only sold the small McDonald's hamburger. You probably have never even seen the early McDonald's.
No.
But the organizers,
Right.
brought lots of McDonald's foods for us to eat because, we were there all day and we certainly didn't get fed in any of the places that we went to. So I had heard about food in jail and how disgusting it was and so on. And so I looked at all of this stuff, this big buffet of McDonald's, and I had big pockets in my dress. And so I filled my pockets with hamburgers and stuff because I figured that cold McDonald's was going to be better than whatever they gave us.
And you didn't know if you were going to be fed again.
Right, exactly. So they fortunately did not physically search us because by the time we got to the prison that we went in a paddy wagon, we didn't know where we were being taken. It was dark. So I guess I would say the prison staff were maybe tired too. So they did not frisk us or go through our bags or anything. They just kind of shoved us into the cell, which is kind of like a cage. So I immediately, not knowing if they were going to come back and frisk us or what was going to happen, so I emptied my pockets and put them under the mattresses on the first level. They were triple bunk beds. So under the mattresses on the first level, and told my cellmates, don't sit down. There are hamburgers there. Exactly. So the next morning was when we ate the hamburgers.
Right.
They served us cold, greasy coffee and cold toast, burnt toast, and I think there was bologna also. And I said, don't worry, we got this. And after they left the food there and left, then we pulled the hamburgers out. And yes, indeed, cold McDonald's saved the day.
Thank you. So, Miki, it sounds like seemed like an unknown preliminary preparation for the big march, as it were, on Washington. So if we could talk about that a little bit more, so the March on Washington, describe your involvement in the weeks, months leading up to that. How did you prepare? What did you essentially know? And what did you think that was going to do?
So we knew in the Nonviolent Action Group, NAG, we knew that volunteers were needed for sort of the local organizing committee. It was at that time that I met A. Philip Randolph, who came and talked to NAG members, but because I was the little sister of those guys that I told you about, I got to sit in on meetings, got to break bread with him, got to know him sort of again as a mascot. And one thing I do want to say from this point in time, the women's movement was just beginning. So I look back on that time, and seldom were there women that were actively involved at Howard. That is not to say that there weren't women who were involved in more, what would I say, activist environments farther south. Fannie Lou Hamer and all of those people who, were definitely active in that way. But the students at Howard, the women were not that active. So again, it would be me and my brothers, and there was a lot of strategizing, a lot of discussion over the months in advance. And I'm not sure how early the planning began, but I became involved as a volunteer that summer. I stayed down for summer school, took one course, so I could fulfill that. Right. And basically my job was whatever they wanted us to do in an organizational sense. We were volunteers. The work ranged from again, this was pre-computers, or there were computers, but people did not have their own computers, and organizations did not have that kind of equipment. So these were the days of mimeograph machines. Oh my goodness, mimeograph machines. This was a way of duplicating information. And so there were all of these old-fashioned ways that have gone by the wayside, but was very hand-on at the time. So to do a mailing, for example, you had long tables set up with the items that were going to be mailed. And because this was a national event, we were sending information to local organizations in every single state. So we did a lot of mailings, a lot of discussions of how information should be organized and who should be invited, and answering questions from local groups that wanted to come, questions ranging from where was their lodging, where was their food, should they bring this, should they bring that. It was a huge undertaking. And I learned probably more about planning big events in being involved in that than anything that I learned in coursework in the classroom. The other thing that I learned was that if you want people to work, you need to feed them. So one of my tasks was I pass a donut shop on the way to the place where we volunteered, and I would pick up the donuts in the morning, and so you'd have to keep people fed, and so they would keep coming back.
Yes. So, we're at March 1963, and the March on Washington, and after that, right, it seems like that was a big pinnacle, and that was the highlight at the time. So for you, Miki, did you continue your involvement with NAG? And we're going to then kind of segue into, then you left and went to the continent Africa. So if you could take us along that journey and bring us to that point about Africa. So finishing with your involvement, if you did finish with NAG, and then to Africa.
Well, I stayed with NAG as a student really until I graduated. So I graduated, well, before I graduated, I married Butch, and we then lived life as a student couple, I guess I would say. Oh. So he graduated first, then I graduated, and then we moved away to the Boston area. We lived in Boston for maybe about 3-4 years. While we were in Boston, we adopted 2 children. And, and before we went to Boston, we adopted a dog, or the dog adopted us, I'm not sure which. But now we had this little family of Butch and me, 2 kids, and a dog. Maybe, yes. So we were working in Boston. Butch went to do graduate work in the Boston area. But what was really in our hearts was that we wanted to go to Africa. And we had a time constraint in the sense that his mother had cancer and she was in remission. We had 2 kids who were still at the age that you could get the airline tickets at a discounted rate. So it was like, okay, we need to go now. Because the kids will only grow up and then we'll have to pay for them as grown kids. Or that my mother-in-law, who is in remission, God forbid, might get sick again. So we figured we spent a year where we squirreled our money away and until we had enough to pay to go over there. And we lived in Kenya. We chose to go to Kenya, which is in East Africa. And we lived there for 4 years. We chose Kenya because we were really interested in Tanzania, which was a socialist country, and we wanted to know how did a socialist country actually function. But one of the sort of good news, bad news things was that in Tanzania, expatriates could not get employment as easily as they could get employment in Kenya. So since the countries were side by side, we had to content ourselves with living in Kenya where we could get work and visiting Tanzania. So that was our compromise and why we ended up in East Africa as opposed to West Africa.
How was that for you? Because it sounds like you're going from different, let's call them climates. How do you feel that kind of shaped you? Do you have anything to share with us on how your perspective on that, those changes?
Well, I loved it in Kenya. The big change was that Kenya's business, how they ran the government, the rules and regs, was Kenya's business, not mine. So even though there were things that I didn't care for, I didn't feel that it was my place to make those changes. In the United States, I felt that if I see something wrong, it's my responsibility to do something about it. In Kenya, it's my responsibility to see it, see how it affects people, learn from it, but not to go rallying the troops in Kenya. That's the attitude that I took. I learned so much just getting to know people and their lifestyles and how it is to live in a former British colony. And that a lot of the issues were issues that evolved out of colonialism in Kenya, in East Africa in general. There were issues around tribalism, which was a whole separate thing from the issues that we faced here in the United States. But it was part of human nature that if you could find some way to divide yourselves, you know, it seemed that people would. So that was interesting. It was interesting seeing how diverse communities in East Africa treated each other, interacted, and so on. So, and because I made a commitment that there was a large expatriate American community there, and they hung out together and they partied together and they had 4th of July picnics, you know, there in Kenya. So I made the commitment that I was not going to hang out with American expatriates, that I was going to get to know and hang out with Kenyans. That's what I was there for. And that worked out very well. I was invited to people's homes. I invited them to my home. We shared. An example of the sharing and maybe the extent of my activism as a non-activist. I got a job as a fabric designer. And the job was to design fabrics that were rooted or based in East African history and culture, so that I would look at and research traditional designs, and based on them, I would develop designs for fabrics. So one day, the factory was owned by a Swedish group. It was a white woman who offered me the job. And I noticed whenever I would go down to the factory that I never saw any black people. So finally I said, "Do you have any black designers?" "Well, we couldn't find any." Like, you're in a black country. You couldn't find any black designers? And because I began to feel a little bit guilty and creepy about that whole process of getting employed there was so easy for me. So I said, if I bring you black designers, will you look at their work and use them if it's the kind of work you want? And they said, "Oh yeah, we don't have any problem with it. We just couldn't find any." I said, "Right." So that became my project, and I actually offered classes in my backyard in fabric design, and you know what it was, how you do it. And I said, you know, I can't guarantee that they'll take your design, but I'll do my best to, you know, figure out a design that you are satisfied with and that they will be satisfied with. And so that became a little project of mine, and all of my students had fabrics accepted, designs accepted, and went on to the next design. So it wasn't difficult, and they were like, "Where did you find these people?" You know, they're on every street corner. You know?
It sounds like, Miki, that you were being an activist as well when you were there, but not so much in a threatening manner.
Right. I was not demonstrating or opposing the Kenyan government,
Right.
but I was sharing the opportunities that I had been given.
And learn the skills that you learned from nonviolence. But I want to bring us back now to the United States after your time in Kenya and talk the relationship you and your mother and Hamilton Hill Arts Center. If you could talk to us, if you will, about the Hamilton Hill Arts Center and the mission behind that and your involvement.
Before I do that, I just want to share one other thing.
Please.
While I was in Kenya, which is that we became involved with Africans from South Africa who were involved in the freedom movement there. And we became known, as we were known in Washington. I didn't really talk about that, but we became known as a safe place for people who were fleeing South Africa, or who were activists in South Africa but needed a break, needed time to just kind of, escape from there, gathering their energies to go back. So our home became that place where you would be fed and given a place to sleep and, discuss tactics, compare things in the United States with things in South Africa and so on. So I think that was important to us and important to the people who came.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now the Hamilton Hill Arts Center.
Yes.
So my mother felt like she had, in many ways, a privileged life, having married my dad, who ultimately became a psychiatrist, first black psychiatrist in the area, by the way.
In upstate New York, Albany area?
In the Albany Tri-City Capital District area.
Albany, Schenectady, Troy.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Very good.
So that afforded them a very comfortable living. Mom was aware of my activities, and she felt like she wanted and needed to contribute in ways that go beyond donations. She had done fundraising in various ways, but she felt like she needed more hands-on. And one of the situations she was aware of is that there were after-school sports programs, basketball and the like, but there was nothing for those who were not interested in sports. Art being her thing, that was the way for her to use her own skills, talents, to benefit the community. This was also at the time of the Black Arts Movement. And the Black Arts Movement came out of the Civil Rights Movement, and it was the conscious and deliberate use of music, poetry, plays, visual arts, all of these things, to support the movement, not to support financially, but if you have never experienced the way life is for Black people in southern areas, for example, that a painting begins to give you a sense of what that life is like. If you've never been to a demonstration, a painting of dogs attacking demonstrators gives you a sense of what's at risk and what you are doing. Mom had studied at Hampton with Victor Lowenfeld, who is a well-known child, a support of children's art. and the importance of children's art, the importance that the younger you offer art opportunities to kids, the more ways they have to express themselves. So Mom, based on her studies with Victor Lowenfeld, felt that this was needed in the low-income community of Hamilton Hill. And at the same time, a woman that she knew was starting Head Start. And she felt like, okay, we have a good program for kids, Head Start age, but what do we have for their older siblings? And so the two women came together, and out of that came the Hamilton Hill Art Center, which is more than 50 years old today. Mom was there for maybe 28 years. And then I came on board, not immediately, there were some other people in between, but then I came on board and I was there for 14, 15 years. And then I retired, and the reality is that I'm still there because I'm still breathing. And then after me, my daughter is now the director of Hamilton Hill. And so there's a legacy there that is not just important to us, but what we see is that the families that come to the Hamilton Hill Art Center appreciate that legacy too. And there are those who remember my mother, and those who remember me, and now those who are working with my daughter. So that has been, and it's been a struggle. It's kind of getting funding something like that is really difficult. Paying staff, the whole thing. It's a struggle, but it's an important struggle. And again, it is a form of activism. The past 2 years, through my daughter Rachel, the Art Center's been very involved in the, I've forgotten the name that I want to say, but anyway, other activist activities.
Yes.
Today is the Black Arts Festival, and the Art Center is offering African dance and drumming and other activities.
So activism, it's a part of you. And Juneteenth
Yes.
is Miss Miki Conn in the city of Schenectady. Talk to us about Juneteenth.
Well, like many people, I had never heard of Juneteenth. And a friend of mine said, as many do, you should plan a Juneteenth celebration. She said, you know, they have a really big one in Buffalo. And I said, what the heck is Juneteenth? You know, I never heard of it. By now, however, we have the internet. And so I had to go online and find out what is Juneteenth. And when I did, I realized this was indeed something that we should be celebrating. And jumped in with both feet. This past summer was our 28th, 25th year doing Juneteenth. In the beginning, nobody knew what it was, like me, and so there was an educational process as people began to learn about it. And then as people did begin to learn about it, then other organizations began hosting their own Juneteenth celebrations. And that is, you know, they say the sincerest form of flattery is copying it. And so now there are churches that have Juneteenth celebrations, there are community organizations. Juneteenth, and as you know, Juneteenth has become a national and a statewide celebration holiday. So I'm really glad and feel that I had a part that I played in that process.
So before I ask the last question, Miki, if you can share with us, you are an author.
Yes.
If you would like to please introduce your book and talk to us just a little bit about that, and then we'll end it with the final question.
Okay. So I started writing, I always have written, let me put it that way. Writing and reading were sort of the two things that kept me sane during my years in Del Mar. But I didn't know whether I was a decent writer or not. I just enjoyed writing. So my first book actually was a book of poetry that I had written over the years, and I would participate in poetry readings, and inevitably someone would come and say, "Do you have a book?" And I would say, "No." So that had to be the first book, the collection of my poems, and self-published because I didn't really want to go through all of the rejection and the process of working with a publisher. When you self-publish, it's like your vision. And so the book, the first book, I thought of as a gift to my grandchildren and my children. They would have something, a legacy project. They would have something to remember me by. And then I thought, well, since I'm doing that, what about, instead of illustrating it poem by poem, what if I group the poems in sections and choose from my own artwork, art for each section? And that then the kids will have my words and my artwork, my visual art. And now one of the projects in 2003-04 is to do the audio book. So then they'll have my voice and my words and my images. So that's the first book, but except that the Integrating Del Mar book came first. It was not my book. That was my mother and her friend Arlen, who was the woman who rented to us in Del Mar. Mom and Arlen became close friends. They both kept journals during this period of time, which they did not know. They did not know that each did not know that the other kept a journal, nor did their spouses know. So there were these secret journals. And years later, when they were both kind of getting on in age, Arlen said to Mom, "You know, I kept these notes, this journal and blah, blah, blah." And Mom said, "I did too." So Integrating Del Mar was their journal entries, alternating voices. So one chapter would be Mom's voice, next chapter would be Arlen's voice, back and forth, showing what the whole experience was like for the two of them. And because they were both elderly and they had not published a book, they said, "Well, we'll get Miki to do it." So, I couldn't say no to them. And in fact, it was during this process, I had a dream that my mother was sitting in a rocking chair and she was holding the finished book. So Mom was, really getting on, and I thought, I don't have a lot of time to lollygag around this project if I'm going to make the dream come true and have her, actually holding her book. So it was at that point that I realized I needed to retire from the Art Center and throw myself into getting this book done. And we did.
Yes.
We got it done. It's still available on Amazon. And it's called Integrating Del Mar, 1957, The Story of a Friendship. And that actually gave me the courage to start publishing my own books. I found online this self-publishing school where they do some hand-holding and encouraging and so on. And so the poetry book came next. And then I started writing children's books. It's like I had this backlog of ideas that were just waiting for an opportunity to ooze out. So the book that I've just published is my third children's book. And all of the children's books feature African American or people of color, because that's part of my mission, that I want to make those kinds of books as available as possible. The two latest books are about a religion that comes from Africa. Some people call it the Yoruba religion. Some people call it Santeria. There are a whole variety of names for the religion. But what I realized is, as my daughter and I gravitated towards that religion, probably in part because of our African roots and our experiences and so forth, that while there's more and more published for adults about the various aspects of the religion, very little for children. And so I decided that was a niche that I wanted to fill, and that it seemed to me that children growing up in the religion would benefit from those books, but also children whose parents wanted them to understand that there's a diversity in culture and in religion and so forth, and that it's important to have an idea of what life is like in other places. So it's not it's not an evangelical process, but it's more learning about how these are some of the things. And the books are focused on the gods and goddesses who we call orishas in that particular religion. So just like Christians talk about angels, so the Africans and African Americans who follow this religion talk about the orishas. So it's a nice way to learn about that and the customs and all.
Thank you. So my last question to you is there anything that you would like to share with everybody and anybody, but more so like the younger generation, about activism, civil rights, caring for others, and maybe even picking a path that they can follow that can attribute to those particular behaviors?
Yes. I would like to see all young people become activists, if not for their lives, for a spell. I think there is enough wrong in the world to go around, that there's something for everybody to do. And I say to young people that when you negotiate your way through life and you see things and your heart tells you, well, that's just not right, you don't have to wish that somebody would do something about it. If you recognize that it's not right, then the second part is to think about what can you do about it, having seen it. You saw it, you observed it, you felt it, you maybe experienced it, or you heard about it. And this is everything from racial issues to food issues to any kind of way that you see that the world could be a better place if you put your efforts into making it happen. The other thing is that not everyone is cut out to be a leader. And we need leaders, yes, but we also need followers, because who are the leaders going to lead? You know? So for me, for example, I understood that I did not have the personality to stand in front of 1,000 people and, rally them forth. That's not who I am. That did not mean there was no work for me to do. And I found lots and lots of work to do. I found who the leaders were and made myself available to them and looked for opportunities where I could contribute in the way that I do best. And so I say to young people, think about yourself, think about what you're good at, think about what you like doing, and then think about how you can use that to contribute to efforts to making the world a better place. So, the March on Washington was an all-day event, and those of us who were organizers were told to get there very early. It was still dark when we got there, and there was fog covering all of the grounds. You could not see anything. There were just little pieces of people here and there getting things ready. We had a booth, a square booth, and lots of boxes had already been placed there, and others that we brought with us, full of paper. I don't know how many trees were sacrificed for this effort. We had to stack the paper on the, not shelves, but sort of tables that made a square, because we were the information table for people who had come to the march. If they wanted to know what was going on in their communities, we had information on it. If they wanted to know who to contact in order to continue to be an activist, we had the phone numbers and the names. So we had everything you could possibly wonder about, so that if you were sitting on the bus and something came to you and you thought on your ride home, I wonder, somebody else had picked up a paper, I got this over, at the information table. So I was there early setting up. And there was so much to set up that at some point I realized that I could see now that the sun had come up, and that where there had been no people, there were now sprinklings of people, larger and larger groups of people. The buses were arriving. I couldn't see the buses, but I could see the people kind of, entering the area. And as time went on, I looked up, and it was wall-to-wall people. I mean, you could not see a space that was empty. And in fact, at some point, somebody said to me, one of the organizers said, well, Miki, why don't you take a break? You've been here since the early dawn. And I looked out at the crowd and I said, I'm good. I'm going to stay right here. Because I didn't know if you left the booth, how would you ever find it to come back? You could hear the speeches going on and the singing and so on. The sound stuff wasn't as good back then as it is now. So there was a lot of feedback and echoey sounds. So I didn't really get to hear the famous March on Washington speech, that kind of thing, until later. There were obviously recordings, but during the event, I didn't get to hear it. But I was happy staying right there in that booth. Now, one wonderful thing that happened is that my parents and my sister came down on a bus from Albany. And they said they would meet me there. But, you know, once I saw how full and crowded it was, I thought, well, scratch that idea. There's no way they're going to be able to find me. But they did. They found, and at some point somebody said to me, Miki, your folks are here. It's like, wow, they actually found me. So that was nice, and it made it an event that the whole family participated in.